When Hollywood legend Harrison Ford stepped onto the View, he expected a routine interview. But within moments, Joy Behar, armed with sharp questions and pointed commentary, turned the conversation into something far more personal and explosive. What followed wasn't just an argument, it was a cultural confrontation. By the time it ended, nothing about either of them or the show would ever be the same. The moment Ford stepped onto the set, something shifted. The applause was warm, routine, rehearsed. It had done been less than 30 seconds before Joy leaned forward, eyes gleaming under the stage lights, and fired the first shot. "So, you're still clinging to Han Solo like that's the only identity you've ever had." A beat of silence. Then a gasp rippled through the studio audience. A few people laughed nervously, unsure whether to treat it as a joke or a jab. Ford didn't respond immediately. He stood at his mark, the corners of his mouth unmoving, eyes scanning the panel. Not a flicker of amusement. Whoopi Goldberg, seated just a chair away, tried to smooth things over with a half-laugh. "Joy means well. You've really embodied some iconic roles." Harrison, the tension didn't fade. If anything, it thickened. Ford finally moved. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like a man used to walking into danger, not in a rush, not rattled. He nodded once toward Whoopi, a small gesture of acknowledgement, then locked his gaze back on Joy, saying nothing. It wasn't defiance, not quite. It was something colder, a scrutiny that made the air feel heavier. The camera stayed on him, zooming in slowly. His silence stretched no more than a few seconds, but it landed like a verdict. Joy tilted her head slightly, still smiling, but tight now, unsure what she'd just triggered. Behind the scenes, the floor manager raised an eyebrow. This wasn't in the run sheet. Ford stepped around the panel and took his seat, but didn't take his eyes off Joy. He moved with steady gravity, impossible to look away from, like an unplanned scene unfolding. The audience, sensing the undercurrent, went completely silent. No coughs, no shuffling, just the faint hum of studio lights and the slow, precise sound of Ford settling into his chair. He adjusted his jacket, quiet, then looked up straight at Joy. "You have something you want to say?" he said, voice low and controlled. Joy raised both brows, but before she could speak, Ford cut her off softly, calmly, but with unmistakable edge. "Let's make sure it's worth everyone's time." The audience didn't cheer. They held their breath. Whatever was supposed to happen that day was already off script, and they all knew it. Joy leaned back in her chair, a satisfied gleam in her eye, like she'd just uncorked a bottle that had been shaking for years. Ford didn't flinch. He simply looked at her. The same unreadable calm stretched across his face like armor. But behind the eyes, something had shifted. This wasn't going to be a cheerful stroll down memory lane. Harrison Ford had been through wars, not just on screen, but off. The kind of man who once flew his own helicopter into a burning canyon to rescue stranded hikers. The kind who, at 70 plus, still did his own stunts because he didn't believe in faking what mattered. In Hollywood, that grit wasn't taught. It was earned, one scar at a time. Over decades, he dodged studio politics, outlived tabloid culture, and chosen quiet action over loud virtue. No tweet storms, no had just show up, do the work, disappear. But none of that mattered now. Not Eric. Across from him sat Joy Behar, queen of the daytime inquisition, armed with facts, rumors, a sharpened tongue, and decades of experience poking at the soft spots of celebrity egos until they cracked or snapped. To her audience, she wasn't mean. She was honest. She said what people were thinking but were too polite to voice. And today, she had Harrison Ford in her crosshairs. The set of The View was warm with lights. Polished to perfection, the stage was designed for comfort. But suddenly, it felt like a courtroom for the witness. Joy the prosecutor, she tapped a note card against the table like a gavel. "We've seen you play heroes, legends, men who run toward danger. But what I want to know, Harrison, is, When's the last time you ran toward the truth? Laughter trickled through the audience, nervous and hesitant. Whoopi shifted in her seat, glancing at the producer off camera as if to ask, "Are we really doing this?" Ford blinked once. The line had been drawn. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, letting his gaze sweep the room. The studio was quiet now, expectant. You could hear the fabric of his jacket as he adjusted his sleeve. "I thought we were here to talk about the film," he said finally, measured and unhurried. "That's what your producers told mine." Joy gave a little shrug, unapologetic. Plans change. The audience wants something real, not another promo tour dressed up like a conversation that landed. The implication was clear. Joy saw this as her moment to pull back the curtain and show the public the man behind the icon. The man who, in her words, just a week earlier on a different episode, had been living on cinematic fumes. Ford leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. No smile now, just clarity. "You think because I don't explain myself to every microphone, that means I have nothing real to say?" Joy didn't back down. "I think a lot of people wonder if the version of you they admire in movies is anywhere close to the one sitting here now." No, they're slow and deliberate. "And I think people wonder if the version of you on TV is any different when the cameras stop rolling." A soft murmur ran through the crowd. Not laughter, not shock, just realization. This wasn't banter anymore, it was a reckoning. Joy's eyes narrowed. "I ask tough questions. That's my job, and I answer them when they're asked in good faith." "For a second," Ford replied. The panel froze. Even the crew seemed unsure whether to cut to commercial or let it ride. Joy didn't blink. Good faith, like pretending everything's fine while California burns and celebrities fly to climate summits in private jets. There it was, the pivot. She wasn't just calling out Ford. She was calling out the whole idea of celebrity virtue. The shiny facade of do-gooders, too rich, too distant, too polished to relate to the people watching from home. Ford exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, voice low, almost conversational, "I didn't come here to defend my life, but I've flown rescue ops. I've donated 2 firefighting units that don't even have boots for their rookies. I don't do that for headlines." Joy crossed her arms. "And yet, here we are." Another silence. He stared at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "No," he said. "Here you are." The audience fell quiet again. All smiles were gone. Something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just a talk show segment anymore, it was 2 worldviews colliding. One rooted in sharp words, the other in silent actions. The battle lines were clear, and no one knew where it would go next. Joy flipped her cue card like it was nothing, as if the weight of the moment hadn't already split the air in half. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, almost casual. Harrison Ford used to act with fire. Now he just shows up and recites lines like he's sleepwalking through the same old roles. It was a user Quatriel Talk 95 with over 2,000 likes. A ripple passed through the audience. Not laughter, not gasps. Just shared awkwardness. Like everyone had been caught eavesdropping on something personal. Whoopi shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. The camera didn't cut away this time. It stayed on Ford. He didn't blink. For a few long seconds, it was like he was processing more than just the quote. Maybe the audacity. Maybe the familiarity. Maybe the fact that after 50 years in the business, someone still thought a Twitter handle could sum him up in a sentence. Then he smiled, not wide, not warm, but a slight pull at the corners of his mouth, a flicker of knowing amusement. He adjusted his cuff, took a measured breath, and looked straight at Joy. "I read that one," he said. Joy raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "So it stuck with you?" "No," Ford said, voice even. "I read it while patching the roof of my house. Wind, damage. The place nearly burned down in the fires last year. You learn to multitask." A few chuckles ran through the audience dry, hesitant, more relief than humor. The comment had been meant as a cut, but Ford turned it into a deflection. Not defensive. Not angry, just real. A man talking about smoke and nails, while the internet debated performance notes. Hoy leaned in, her tone laced with sugar. So, no reaction at all. Doesn't sting even a little? Ford looked down for a beat. When he looked back up, the smile was gone. I've been in front of cameras longer than Real Talk 95 has been alive. I've read worse. I've lived through worse. Opinions don't sting. What stings is watching people suffer while we sit in studios and debate whether their pain is trending enough to matter. The temperature in the room dropped. Even Joy blinked. Whoopi cleared her throat, about to jump in, but caught the producer's eye and held back. The crew behind the scenes stayed still, no hand signals. No countdown to break. Everyone understood something was unraveling live, and they weren't about to miss it. Joy, always quick to pivot, wasn't deterred. So, let's get specific. The new film another legacy role, another return to familiar ground. Some people say it's safe, that it's comfortable. Ford didn't look away. Some people haven't read the script. That one landed. A soft murmur rose from the back rows. Someone clapped once, then stopped. It wasn't a mic drop moment, colder, more surgical. Joy tried again. But don't you think audiences want to see something new? A different side of Harrison Ford. Not just the grizzled icon doing the same moves. He didn't hesitate. I think audiences want honesty. If I can't offer that, I don't take the role. But if I take it, I commit fully. Even when it's a paycheck, she pressed. Ford let out a breath. Almost a laugh, but not. Kita, you know what a paycheck meant to me when I started? Rent, groceries, gas to get 2 auditions, where they told me I was too plain, too quiet, to this, to that. I've taken jobs to survive, but I've never phoned it in. Not once. The silence that followed wasn't just respectful, it was stunned. The studios seemed to realize it had been watching a man speak truths they didn't expect him to own. Joy tapped her pen on the desk, not quite ready to surrender. That's a good speech. Ford tilted his head. It's not a speech. It's my life. With that, the air shifted again. The tension didn't fade, but evolved from a talk show sparring match into something weightier, more personal. This wasn't just about one man's acting choices anymore. It was about who had the right to judge someone's journey from the safety of a studio seat. The camera zoomed slightly out. The panel looked smaller now. Ford sat still. Joy blinked once, twice, recalibrating. No one else said a word. They all felt it. Something real had just happened, and no one knew what would come next. Joy didn't let the silence last. She leaned forward again, this time without the coyness. Her voice was firmer, sharper, louder. The smile was gone. The gloves were off. If you're so committed to purpose, Harrison, she said, eyes locked on him, why take millions for roles you've already played a dozen times? Why cash in on nostalgia instead of challenging yourself with something that actually pushes the art forward? It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. For the first time since he'd walked onto the stage, Harrison Ford didn't blink. He didn't deflect. He didn't smile. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. He leaned back in his chair, not away from her, but into himself, centering. Then he leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on the table, hands folded. His voice was calm, stripped of all pretense. No performance, no polish. I was offered a streaming series last year and network money. More than I've ever made on any single project. All I had to do was sit in front of a green screen and deliver dialogue about futuristic coffee machines and robotic pets. 10 episodes. Glossy, soulless, easy. Pause it. The audience was still. Eventually didn't interrupt. I turned it down, he said. Instead, I partnered with a nonprofit to build a mobile library system in rural California. We stocked shelves in towns that hadn't had a public reading space in 30 years. I helped drive the first truck myself. Now he looked directly at her. I didn't post about it, didn't bring a camera crew, No press release, just me, a few teachers, and some kids who thought books were something you only saw in cartoons. Joy's mouth tightened, but she stayed quiet. You want to talk about repetition? Ford continued, his voice a little stronger now. Yes, I've returned to characters. Not because I'm lazy. Because those stories aren't finished. Because people still find meaning in them. Because when a father and son sit down to watch Indiana Jones together for the first time, that's not a rerun, that's a memory being made. He glanced toward the audience, who were holding their breath. And when I do take on a familiar role, he said, turning back to Joy, I do it on my terms. I fight for better scripts. I push directors to try harder. I insist on rehearsals when no one else wants to bother. Because the audience deserves more than a paycheck performance. They deserve intention. There was a long pause. Joy straightened, her voice quieter now, almost begrudging. Then why not walk away entirely if you care that much? Why not stop while your legacy is still intact? Ford tilted his head. Because the work still matters, he said. Not the spotlight, not the press junkets. The work, the process of building something honest with other people who care. He took a breath. Let it sit for a moment, then added, almost like a closing argument. Joy, I don't make films so someone like you can approve of my values. I make films because stories, at their best, create space for people to feel seen, to be heard, to escape. I live to contribute to that, not to explain it. There it was, the line that made the room shift. A single clap came from the back, then another, and soon the audience, as if holding it in, broke into spontaneous applause. Not the kind forced by cue cards, not the kind that faded too quickly. This was earned. Joy didn't clap. She folded her arms, glanced toward the control room. But she couldn't stop the momentum. Ford sat back in his chair, not smug, not triumphant, just steady, rooted. His hands rested in his lap, shoulders squared. He wasn't basking in the applause. He was simply existing in it. The power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the guest anymore. He was the voice in the room everyone wanted to hear more of. And that, more than any clever line or deflection, was what cracked Joy's composure for the first time. Not the volume of his words, but the weight. She opened her mouth, maybe to pivot, maybe to push again, but hesitated just long enough for the moment to settle into something undeniable. Ford didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The applause was still fading when she leaned forward, voice lower this time, sharper, precise. No smile, no performative warmth, just a single question, cold and cutting as a needle slipping beneath the skin. Then why, she said slowly, did you stay silent when the allegations came out about your director on Echoes of the Republic? The words hit like a slap. For a second, it seemed as if the entire studio had stopped breathing. A subtle tension swept through the room, making even the camera operators hesitate. The applause died completely. No one moved. Ford didn't look away. He didn't blink. He sat very still, the corners of his mouth unmoving, jaw tense but not clenched. He looked like a man who had expected that question for a long time, maybe too long. Joy's voice stayed even, but there was a new edge to it. People noticed Harrison. People noticed when you didn't say anything. When the news broke that he'd been accused of misconduct on multiple sets, people noticed your silence. Another pause, calculated, measured. And they wondered, she said almost gently now, if the man who flies rescue helicopters and funds reading programs disappears when it's inconvenient, when it's messy. Her words weren't loud, but they echoed. Ford's hands were folded in front of him. He looked down for a long moment, not away, not a sim, just down, as if choosing how much of the truth to reveal. Then he looked up. I didn't issue a statement, he said, voice low but clear. That's true. Joy didn't respond. She let the silence hang, hoping it would speak louder than his words. But I made a call. Ford's gaze rested on the woman at the center of the story. I didn't know her well. We only worked on set a few days together, but I remembered her, and I believed her. Pause. I told her I wasn't going to speak to the press, not because I didn't support her, but because I didn't want to turn her story into a headline with my name on it. He let that settle. I also told the studio I wouldn't be returning for the sequel. The words landed heavy. I walked away from a deal worth 8 figures. I didn't announce it. I didn't do an interview. I just walked away. Joy shifted, caught off guard not by the content, but by the simplicity of his delivery. There was no bitterness, no theatrics. Just fact. I've spent a career building stories, Ford continued. I know what the media does with them. They twist things. They pit voices against each other. I didn't want her experience reduced to my reaction. That wasn't the point. The audience was silent now. No whispers, no fidgeting, just stillness. I checked in with her 6 months later. He added quietly, privately. Not for optics, not for applause, just to know how she was doing. Joy didn't move. She blinked once, fingers flexing slightly on the desk. Ford leaned forward, voice softer now, yet somehow heavier. There are moments, Joy, when doing the right thing, doesn't need to be seen. It just needs to be done. The audience stayed silent, waiting. We live in a world, he continued, looking past the stage lights, where silence is often treated like guilt. Sometimes, that's fair. But sometimes, silence is the only way to protect someone else's story from becoming your own. The moment lingered. I didn't know about the phone call, Joy said finally. You weren't supposed to, Ford replied. That was the twist of thing no one saw coming. Not defense, not a counterattack. Just truth. Quiet, steady, inarguable. A studio light flickered near the back wall. A camera adjusted focus. Someone in the front row slowly covered their mouths, not in shock, but in reverence. Joy looked down at her notes, then back up. Her voice had lost its edge. And the sequel? She asked, not Ford. Shook his head. They offered to rewrite it. Said they'd fire the director. Said I'd have full creative control. Pause, but the story wasn't mine to save anymore. So, I let it go. The breaths passed through the room, the kind people don't ben release. They're holding until it leaves them. Joy leaned back slightly. Her posture shifted, less combative, more unsettled. Ford's voice dropped again, the way it had when he spoke about the library truck and kids discovering books. I don't need credit for doing the right thing, and I don't need to be forgiven for someone else's choices. What I need is to know that I never became the kind of man who hides behind applause. The audience remained silent, not because they didn't believe him, but because they did. Joy didn't respond. For the first time in the interview, she seemed without a follow-up. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. A red light blinked near the floor camera. The moment was no longer just a conversation. It had become something larger. Ford's set bike hands folded again. His final line wasn't shouted. It wasn't delivered with flourish. But it landed like a final note in a long, difficult symphony. Sometimes, he said, the loudest thing you can do is say nothing at all. The room stayed silent. The silence had stretched long enough to become its own presence. Not forced, but reverent, the kind of quiet that follows truth. Joy sat still, fingers curled loosely around her pen, eyes searching a distant point between them. It was clear she hadn't expected that answer, not the phone call, not the walk away, not the wait behind the words. Ford wasn't pressing, he wasn't gloating. He wasn't trying to win. That was the most disarming part. He simply sat, having said what needed to be said, content to let it settle. His stillness spoke louder than any applause. Then he leaned forward again, without tension. Voice softer, but purposeful. You know, he said, not to Joy, but to the room, to the air, to anyone still listening through the cameras. We don't have to keep doing this like enemies. Joy looked up slowly, unsure if it was a statement or a challenge. For went on. Every time an artist speaks, someone asks if they're qualified. Every time a journalist questions power, someone calls it an ambush. Meanwhile, the people who actually need help young creators. Communities without access. Storytellers with voices but no platforms, they're stuck in the middle, watching the whole thing burn. Paused, letting it sink in. So what if, he continued, instead of this debate, we started something different? What if this show, this exact one right here, became a space where we didn't just talk about the work, but supported it? What if we built a segment where artists from underserved communities got a spotlight? No agents, no red carpets, just people with something real to say, and nowhere else to say it. There was a subtle shift in the room. Shoulders straightened, eyes widened slightly. A soft, involuntary murmur came from the audience. Yeah, Ford didn't stop. I'd help fund it, he said quietly. If need be. No headlines, just a promise. You provide the seat. I'll help provide the story. Joy blinked, not thrown off, but thoughtful. You could see her mind working, the calculations folding into each other. This wasn't a trap. This wasn't a pivot. It was something else. From the back corner, a stage assistant walked over and handed a tablet to the producer. Real-time feedback from the live stream. The screen was shown briefly to Whoopi, who read it aloud almost to herself, as if surprised. There's a comment from a viewer, she said, glancing around. High school senior says, and I quote, "Could the media and artists stop fighting long enough to build something for us instead?" Joy exhaled slowly. The cameras were still rolling, still catching every blink and breath. I get paid to ask questions, she said finally, voice lower than before, to challenge, to push when people get too comfortable. Know that's important. It is. But sometimes people mistake conflict for clarity. Joy studied him for a moment, then turned to the audience. I've spent a long time believing that pressing hard gets you the truth. Maybe sometimes it does, but maybe sometimes the truth speaks better when we're not yelling over it. It wasn't a concession, not exactly, but it wasn't a counterattack either. Ford glanced at Whoopi, who gave a half smile and whispered, almost to no one, "This might be the best segment we've had all year." A hum of soft laughter rippled through the room, tension finally giving way to something lighter. Joy turned back to Ford. If we did that segment, if we actually made it happen, would you come back? Ford didn't hesitate. Not to talk about me, he said, but to help others talk about themselves. Absolutely. And there it was. A ceasefire not declared, not formalized, but real, felt, understood. The kind of shift that doesn't need applause to be meaningful. The audience didn't burst into claps this time. They simply leaned forward, listening. The energy wasn't explosive now. It was present, connected. Ford sat back, the fire in him no less alive, but redirected. Joy nodded once slowly and set her pen down. The show hadn't ended, but something else had, something better had just begun. She sat in silence a moment longer, gazed distant but not disconnected. Something had shifted, not in the room, but within her. The woman who had started this segment with a sharpened tongue and an agenda now looked like someone remembering a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't carry its usual cadence. It didn't climb or bite. It simply existed. "Maybe," she said quietly, almost to herself, "maybe I forgot why I started doing this show." The words weren't meant for applause. They weren't dramatic, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that only comes when truth is admitted aloud, even if no one asked for it. Ford didn't respond immediately. He watched her with a calm that had nothing to prove. Then, with a small, measured nod, respectful and deliberate, he stood. The movement was smooth, unhurried, not an exit, but a transition. He stepped away from the panel and turned to the others, extending his hand. One by one, they rose and took it. Whoopi was first, gripping his hand with both of hers and whispering something only they could hear. Sarah followed, her eyes shining briefly before she blinked it away. Sunny simply nodded and offered her palm, a quiet acknowledgement passing between professionals. Then came Joy. She stood not forced, not cornered, but changed. She reached out, shook his hand firmly, yet her expression soft. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Ford turned toward the edge of the stage. The audience, sensing the weight of the moment, remained still, watching, absorbing. Just before stepping past the curtain, he paused and looked into the nearest camera. His voice didn't rise. It didn't falter, yet it carried a clarity that cut through the noise without volume. "Sometimes," he said, "we don't need to win. We just need to walk away without losing ourselves." A few beats passed. He nodded once more, then disappeared behind the curtain. Joy sat back down, the chair creaking softly beneath her. The lights didn't dim, the music dead on cue. But the room had changed. It was palpable in the hush that followed a sense that something real had happened. Something unscripted, unedited, undeniably human. The camera lingered on her a moment longer. She looked into the lens not as a host, not as a brand, but as a person. "If you're watching this," she said, voice steady but raw, "ask yourself something today. Did you build something, or did you tear someone down?" Her eyes didn't waver, because every time we speak, every time we post, every time we judge, we're doing one or the other, and the world already has enough noise. She let the silence breathe, be the voice that adds, not the one that subtracts. Thanks for watching. The screen began to fade. In that final moment, as the lights settled and the hum of the studio returned to its usual rhythm, no one in the audience moved, not yet. They all knew they had just witnessed something more than an interview. They had seen a confrontation become a conversation, and maybe, just maybe, a conversation could become something greater.